Present. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Pollack. I'm very glad that you joined me today to talk about creating art of science. Today, I'm going to be covering sort of last year's work and the process around last year's work, in part because I don't want to give away too many spoilers for this year's show. And in part because as we go through it and I show you a lot of the images, something pretty interesting kind of happened in last year's making process. I took an excessive amount of screenshots of the work as I was making it. And I don't always do that. You know, I think as professionals, we often try to create systems where we capture our work in progress and really show that. But I think it's a really hard thing to do because it takes a lot of time to catalog something while you're doing it. And if you're frustrated with it or you're trying to figure it out, cataloging it is not really a thing that's central to your mind. But I think really I think there's a couple of different reasons. Because the pandemic has been so life-changing and shifting, I think it was honestly a way to kind of look at my labor more clearly and just see it shift, see actual changes in what I was doing and assure myself the time was passing. And I think the other part of it was for this show, since we did the show outside in the park, there were only 5 pieces. So I worked really hard to create a real visual system between all the pieces. So they really worked together. So I went back and continued to edit the work and again. So this talk is based on looking at all of those images. And I think you can kind of get a view into my thinking process. And if you've ever sort of looked over someone's shoulder as they were making something, I always think that's kind of a fascinating experience, because you get to see someone sort of ambiently moving something or shifting something or changing something. So this is sort of what will come up a lot in this talk. So thank you for coming. I'll do a little bit of background. And I will tell everyone that the Art of Science Spring Show Interdependencies is Friday, May 6th and May 7th. Come out if you can from 4 to 8 p.m. on Friday. There will be drinks and snacks provided by the Institute at Cafeteria and Company in downtown Urbana. There will be a musician and there will be some words from some of the scientists and our director. So it should be a lovely time. Please come if you are able. So a little bit of history about the Art of Science program. It's been going on for 12 years. And I am the 3rd artist to be the Art of Science artist. Oh, here we go. My process has been a little different. It's been interesting to try to craft my own process for the Art of Science. So in a sort of design mentality, I collect images and I talk to my scientists. I think over things, iterate, approve, and integrate. So that's a very businessy way of thinking about your labor. But if I'm being a little more transparent, the collecting and talking part is my favorite part. It's the most fun and easy because it's the time when the artwork is in the most possibility. So it can become the most things and I get to think of the most ideas. So that's the place that I feel most comfortable in. And the thinking phase of what to do is often confusing and circuitous. Sort of just have to follow where it leads you. Iterating is a stop and go process. Again, I think people will relate to this, but sometimes you can really get in a flow with the pieces that you're making and they really make sense and they move really fast. And sometimes you just hit a wall and everything looks terrible. And that's a really hard space to keep changing and keep moving through things. The strange thing about this art practice that is different than a lot of other art practices is I ask for my scientists' approval. Once I have made the image, I bring it back to them and sort of give them a brief artistic statement about what I did and why I did it. And then I get them to sort of make sure they feel comfortable with the work. And it's been a really interesting process, learning and growing in that way. And it's very nerve-wracking to bring something back to someone and say, is this okay? But it's been an important process to learn more and make the work better. And integrating is always like my biggest thing, and I'm feeling it hugely right now as the show is coming up in a few days, because all the artwork is done for this current show. So it's hard for me because I'm always hoping to do more and improve the body of work and make it better. And when it's all done and I'm waiting for the final presentation, it's the hardest space, because I'm like, I would like to take this piece further, and I would like to change this and really develop this thing. So that's sort of a hard space for me. But it's also, then it leads you back into the easy fun part where you're just collecting things and thinking of a million ideas. So, mixed bag. So I'm going to start with the first 5 scientific images that I collected for last year's spring show. So these right here are a series of composite stone that were imaged in our core microscopy department. There we go. This is a picture of an atomic force microscope used to actually get an image of DNA. And these DNAs, you can see they're in diamond shapes. They are origami DNA. So they have designed a way to actually fold DNA structures into different shapes and then build scaffoldings out of the DNA. And the atomic force microscope is really cool. It's almost like, I think of it like Braille. There's actually movement. You're sort of measuring the topography of the subject and then imaging that topography. Yeah. See, this thing's a little hinky. Sorry, I'll try to go to clicking. This is a image of breathalyzed air particles. So it's what you breathe out into the air. We'll get to more about that later. And here is a micro CT scan of a fish from the Natural History Collection. Sorry, I'm getting a little load screen lag here. There we are. So when I line up all these images, so each one of these is a different scientist's work that's featured. You can see they look very different. They're a big mishmash of different types of microscopy. They have different visual information at different standards. You can sort of understand them in very different ways. And the next image I'm giving you, the final image, is how I changed all of these images together. So these are the 5 pieces that were the final pieces for last year's show. You can see I sort of built a kind of tarot deck of cards sort of relationship between all of these images, whereas before they don't really go together because they're such different work. And so I view it as my sort of challenge in this process to build a different way of experiencing the scientific images. So there's like a combined idea. So how did I come up with last year's theme? This is a little bit intimate, but here we are, these lovely 18 people. Thank you for coming. Over the pandemic, it was a pretty hard time to stay centered and not lose yourself in all of the different anxieties. And I watched a really great children's show that I suggest to everyone called Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I think it was definitely informed the making of this show. But the premise of this children's show is that they live in this sort of world where there are the 4 elements. So there's earth, air, and fire, and water. And in this world, the conflict is the Fire Nation has taken over the whole world, and they are oppressing all the other peoples of all these different worlds. So these group of kids have to set forth on their adventure, and they have to restore balance to this world. So they have to build earth stuff and wind stuff and water stuff to kind of put the world back into balance, because fire had kind of taken over. And I think a lot of people really relate to this show because it's got some really great themes about humanity, but it really felt truly deeply on point in a time when everyone felt pretty out of control over the last couple of years, that suddenly there were a lot of forces that we had no control over, and how could we regain some balance in our lives. So with that in mind, I sort of built the show with this idea of, what if I could make, if I only have 5 pieces to make, maybe I can visually code these pieces in a very basic way by building an earth piece, a fire piece, a water piece, and an air piece. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, what are the basic patterns and vibrations and colors that I could associate with those things, and try to build the art from this initial idea rather than looking at the individual images first. And that was a real different way of going about it. But ultimately, I got all these cool screenshots, and you'll see them. As you can see, here's the color palette that I kind of got into. It's pretty straightforward. I think that's what most people imagine when you think of a suit like that. So my first image that I worked in was the easiest, right? And I think that popped up in this sort of theme because, you know, Christopher Taylor's image from the Natural History Survey is this fish. So it very clearly feels like a watery piece. It was pretty amazing to work with Chris. So you can see here these CT scans of this fish. So the Natural History Survey at the U of I does an incredible amount of things, but they also have this collection of actual bodied specimens. So they have the bodies of all of these creatures in jars in all these different states. And it's an incredible collection. It can be really useful, but it is difficult to get the data out of that specimen. So there's some really interesting things you can get at by looking at the specimen in its embodied self, but you have to come to our physical location. So part of the reason they used this imaging practice was to create a body of data around this collection so that people remotely could use the actual physical form of the fish through this CT scan data of all of their collection. So it was a really cool opportunity. They're still looking for grant funding to continue this operation because it's going to be a huge undertaking, but it's a really cool idea to grab all of these data layers that you didn't have in the past and be able to recurate your system with this new technology coded on this older information system. This is Chris Taylor. He's a wonderful person to chat with. It was really interesting because he himself is really interested in fish and aquatic creatures. And he was sort of saying there's a lot of things that people don't know or recognize about fish. And this sounds like a silly thing to say, but it was really cool to think about. Here we are, land creatures, and we recognize a lot of other land creatures more acutely. So like a lot of people can name a lot of different birds because we occupy the same space as birds. But fish, we don't live in the water. So there's a huge amount of fish that live very close to us, aquatic creatures that live like in our ecologies close to us that we have no recognition of because we don't look in the water on a regular basis. And Chris is a person who spent a lot of time looking in the water and really enjoys his position, kind of learning about and doing taxonomy around different and new fish species. And he was sort of, his tagline is, if a picture, you know, speaks 1,000 words, imagine how much our new data layers will speak. Many, many more words. And as I was talking to him, as once you get in the weeds with a really cool person that does a lot of really cool research, you learn all sorts of new things. So he told me about Lydia Hart, who was an illustrator at U of I. She worked for the Natural History Survey in 1891. So she was a woman painter illustrator at the turn of the century who worked incredibly in depth in this field of capturing specimens. And we have a huge collection of her work, and she was one of her like notes in the field is she had this very specific ways of using ink, and you can really see it on the scales, to create a really soft definition of texture with the way she used ink in her drawings. And at this time, as photography is developing, and we don't have the same kind of microscopy that we do now, this sort of artistic rendering was a hugely helpful part of the scientific process. And rudely for myself, I just think they're beautiful, which most people feel as well. But it was really incredible to see someone else sort of working in scientific imagery and to be able to become inspired by their work as well and sort of bring it into my own process. So the Natural History Survey keeps track of a lot of data about their specimens. And this is all the places that that specific suckerfish has been collected in Illinois. And as we go through these Illinois maps, again, it was pretty incredible to relearn about the waterways of Illinois. I grew up in Chicago, so I'm very focused on the lake as how I understand water in the state of Illinois. But looking at this data set really changed my perception of that, because it made it so clear, like the shape of Illinois is created by rivers. The reason it's shaped the way it is because of the rivers that outline the state. And it really opened my eyes to all of these small waterways. Like you would think a large fish like that would require, you know, I get in my own non-knowledge about aquatic life, a large body of water. But even in these very small local tributaries, this fish is in all of these different locations. And it was really cool to kind of understand how that worked in a really different way. So I pulled layers from the National Geological Survey sites. And even in this one, you can see the Mississippi River, you know, draws the outside of the shape of Illinois. And you can see the Illinois River that curves through it. You can also see these really soft feathered lines of all of these tributaries throughout the state, these tiny little spaces where water is flowing. And you can really feel the like veins and the sort of small spaces. And when we look at blown out maps and we sort of conceive of ourselves as a state, you know, I don't think we're just looking at it sort of from afar. Once you sort of look at these waterways, it really made me think of why this is called what it's called and how it was determined to be that. So I used Lydia Hart's shape of her suckerfish, the same fish that I'm using for my micro CT drawing, the same fish for this project, as my data point. And I pulled all of those mapped sightings of this suckerfish, and I used her drawing as my point of reference for my suckerfish. And then I built the first piece. You can see in the middle, I pulled in this sort of wavy line as my sort of reference to, okay, what is my water line going to look like? What is my water vibration going to be? Then I pulled in my color palettes. On the bottom, you can see I'm focused on this data set. This idea of this like natural history data set is this like thick data set. And then I have our micro CT scan at the top. And this piece, I was like, okay, this is somewhere interesting. It stayed at this space because I was like, okay, this kind of looks like a natural history survey poster. It looks a little like an infographic. It had gotten to a certain space and I was like, all right, this is in an interesting spot. I think I could maybe, you know, move forward. And then I was like, let's really bring it home. So I often with working with digital images, I like to bring in large, very abstract images to create texture to a drawing, because often when you work just digitally, everything gets very flat. So you can see if it loads, you can do it. There we are. I layered in this water layer and sort of tried to make the paper more alive, as if it were printed on paper, but it was sort of softly moving. I thought the water could maybe be in this more browner kind of color tone, because I was really trying to think about a river color instead of this like lake color, which I shift away from later on, but this is where I left it. I was like, okay, this piece is in an interesting place. Let me keep moving. Let me keep making. So that was an interesting part of this process, is because I really circle back to each piece to make changes and kind of get them all to fit together. So the next piece that I worked on slowly loads. Again, felt obvious. So I had a fish piece that represented water, and then I had Krishna's work, which was construction rock. So it very clearly was earth. And so the Krishna's project is really interesting. It's a structural materials engineer, and he's looking at these construction rocks that are used in when we create and build nuclear power plants. So the places where the cooling happens, the towers, all the structures of the actual physical building for nuclear power are made of something, and they're made of these composite rocks. So his work is to look at this composite stone and all the layers and compounds in it, and to check on its half-life and predict when is the stone might become fallible, when might the stone break down, when might the stone not be working anymore. So it's a real safety check to be able to look into the stone, image it, and try to say like, okay, what is the life of this stone, and how is it shifting, and how is it changing? So you can see the sort of bottom right image is this sort of like from the naked eye image of the rock, and then the top images are different layers of different compounds in the concrete. Krishna told me that he always liked construction as a kid. When I was trying to ask him about why he got to this science and how he started this science. Here we are. And this one was a really interesting process, because these images from Krishna are very, very flat. They're very clearly data layers. You know, one is red, one is green, and one is blue. And then you line them all up and they make still this very flat image. So with this piece, I was almost playing with, it was like sort of, I mean, most Photoshop is like collage. But I was trying to sort of collage these different shapes, see how I could cut these square images into an image that would tell a different story. So I started working in circles, and you can see I'm kind of cutting out all of these microscope images in different shapes and arranging them around. And playing with colors, trying to get it darker or lighter. I very quickly got really focused on thinking about these rocks, and then thinking about like moon cycles. So it would be like a cycle of time, to try to think about time as well as the stone over time, like how is it deteriorating? And you can see in the background, I pulled in this soft layer of the same kind of stone he works in. And then I created my line pattern for stone, which was flatter at the beginning, but then had a soft rise at the end. And then I stepped away and tried a bunch of different shapes. So like, how can I get this to be central to the image? This kind of one line feels a little too like a flag. This one was like getting closer to something that orbits. And then I sort of got to this kind of orbital moon shape. So I have all of these stone layers, and then you can see my line layers, my soft layers in the back, and this kind of way I'm kind of trying to draw your attention to this circular interior image with all of these layers in a circle of time. And this specific image is interesting. You can see I was here in the color palette, and then I shifted it to like a soft brown. So again, I took so many screenshots, but it's like working with something that's grayer and then trying to make it warmer was an interesting, like slow process that I captured all of these slight shifts, which again, I don't always do that when I'm working, but it was really interesting when I started putting together this talk for the core, that as I looked back through all of my materials, I had these really micro shifts in a lot of the pieces to take a look at where they had been and how they had shifted. So if you're listening and doing something else, I'm sorry in advance. I play with a lot of hash marks. We'll sort of get into that as we go, but you sort of like creating equations on the page. You can see the center, there's sort of lines telling you where to look and where to begin. And as I got to this piece, I was sort of like, okay, again, here, this piece is an interesting place. I'm going to stop touching it. I'm going to go on to a new piece and I'm going to come back to it, which is a hard thing to sort of, once you get somewhere, you're like, okay, this visual story is somewhere that makes sense. I don't know if it's done, but I need to keep making art. So I was sort of like, move on to the next piece and see if we can come back to it and shift. So the next piece that will slowly load is Tariq Saf's pieces. And these were pretty incredibly on point for the time period that we were in. So I think you probably all will remember when the pandemic first hit the US, there was a lot of contradictory messages from the CDC about mask requirements. And we found out that was because there was a real concern over shortages for surgical supplies for medical professionals, which is understandable. However, when it became clear that masking really did very specifically help with this very specific disease, the coronavirus is spread not as an aerosol, which is a very small particles, but on a water droplet, like on a molecule. So it's in the wet part of the breath. That masks are highly effective in the spread of the coronavirus because of the size of the particle that it's carried in. And so Saif is a engineer on campus and does all kinds of research. And he called up the core at the IGB and said, okay, I'd really like to do some experiments because it looks like there's actually a gap in the CDC's data. And part of, obviously, because the CDC is a scientific institution, it's only as good as the amount of data it has. And I think that's a hard part about communicating science often, is sort of saying what we do know and what we don't know. And sometimes those things can be kind of complex and difficult to share over a large scope of things. And so Saif put together an experiment where he created, he hooked inhalers who would aerosolize particles up to a dock, and then he grabbed different kinds of household fabrics. So t-shirts, shirts you had lying around, jeans, all different kinds of like basic household fabrics that people would just own in their closets. And he put them in front of the inhaler, and then he shot the inhaler and sort of showed how many molecules could actually make it through these different weaves of clothing. And his data is still one of the very specifically cited papers by the CDC that talks about homemade mask efficacy. So he basically could validate, I think a lot of people before we had the data decided that homemade masks were something we should do, and they did it. And he was one of the first papers that actually could inform medical people that yes, indeed, it was great to have their patients and people wear any kind of homemade mask because it would do a huge percentage of work to stop the spread of the coronavirus. So it was really cool because in our little department where everyone had to go home and figure out what they were doing with all of their different research and all their different data projects, we had the facilities and someone's idea to be able to open up and create a data set about this very specific thing we needed. And it became part of the story of how we, work to inform people about what would help keep people safe. So it's pretty cool to be able to work on an image directly about, what we were all going through. I'm going to bring up a couple of different artists that I focus on in my art making practice. So Hjalmar Olofsson is a Swedish artist from the turn of the century. She's just pretty blown up in in popularity. A lot of her work hadn't been shown in the US, especially very often at all. And in the last 10 years, her work has been made really, really visible. So she was sort of a mystic and an artist, and she was thinking a lot about the sort of energetic components of life. Her work really speaks to me. The abstraction, you can see this red target is very, I think it feels almost like digital to me. Like you could spin it in any direction and it would sort of maintain its shape and its size. And I think in a lot of our microscope images and in a lot of our digital work, often movement or shifting perspective is part of how we understand seeing a digital form. And even though her images are flat, they're very, I think they really speak to geometry and form in a really interesting way that I think also relates to the way we see and understand science. So here's a couple of her excellent pieces that I love on the wall, so you can get a feel for her work. This next image, as it slowly loads, very compelling, is a part of the process that I didn't really know about when I began. I identify more closely as a painter, and sort of I like to make physical objects, and the work that we make here at the IGB is often, the final project is in a digital form, because all of our microscope images are often in a digital form. So it's been a really interesting process to me to try to pull in gradients and soft, less consistent patterns. So I often take a lot of pictures of the sky. And when you take pictures of natural spaces with natural light, you can get really soft gradations. Whereas if you're in a program that's mathematically producing a gradient, like from a soft gradient from different colors, it will do so in such an even tone that you can almost identify it. Like you can tell it sort of looks mechanical. Whereas if you use natural spaces with natural light, you can get these aerial color shifts that operate in a really different way. So you can see this is my air piece in its beginning phases. The two shapes on either side were meant to sort of start representing a diaphragm. So the sort of like way that your diaphragm fills up with your breathe and as you exhale. And then you can see in the middle, there's all these droplets. So I was building these two diaphragms that are kind of breathing at each other. So it was getting to a place, and as I was looking at it, I was like, okay, this is interesting, but it sort of looks a little too much like a fish under the sea. I was feeling like a Little Mermaid vibe with its bright colors and its sort of like squishy blue tones. So I was like, okay, I need to pull this into a different color range to bring it back to feeling like air, to feeling like breath. And then I shifted both of my diaphragms in hopes to kind of create this almost cartoon of the movement of a diaphragm. So like one side is your breath out and one side is your, so one is your inhale and one is your exhale, right? So the sides might have a soft shifting shape to them as you kind of feel the breath moving. And then you can see my air lines as sort of these kind of ripples out into the air, and sort of thinking about also how sound waves move through the air in this very circular pattern. And then this is its accompanying piece. I often try to work in diptychs and triptychs in multiples, because I think when you review a theme multiple times, it can give people a way to sort of understand your pattern and try to think about, okay, what are you saying with this visual theme if you're telling it to me again and again? How is it different in these slightly different forms? So here you can see there are 2 layers of a t-shirt weave material over each of my diaphragms. And there's only a few molecules in the air. And so here's paper was talking about specifically how 2 layers of a t-shirt material has, I forget the percentage, but a huge percentage in the 90s percentage of efficacy against spreading aerosolized or spreading water molecules into the air. And it was really incredible to be able to think about this with him and try to work on it, because he was telling me stories about when he grew up, he didn't have access to a lot of medical supplies. He didn't grow up in a space where he had a lot of access to lots of things. And so his main idea in looking at this data and trying to create this data set for people was to remind people that even if you don't have access, there are things that you can do to protect yourself. And even like pulling your t-shirt over your face in a really scary situation where there's a lot of people or something, when we were before we had a vaccine, in the very early stages, would be a really helpful way to help stop spread or exposure levels. We're slowly loading. On this next slide, there will be such a slight difference, if I'm not mistaken. You can see a tiny hash mark in the middle of the image. Let's go to the next one. So you can see, again, I've sort of showed you, okay, here are my masked images with only a few molecules outside of the breath. And then your unmasked images have this cacophony of molecules kind of floating around in the air. And here will be the 2 pieces side by side, so you can see them together. You can do it. I wonder, I've never done the recording with the YouTube live. I wonder if there's like a little bit of a lag between them, so it gets a little hinky. There we are. So here are the 2 pieces side by side that are paired together, one unmasked and one masked. And again, you can see the lined patterns that I like to play with. I like to create a depth of field, even though the images are abstract and often 2-dimensional. How do I create a background and a foreground and a midground with 2-dimensional objects or very flat images to begin with is one of the biggest and most interesting problems of how to make art of science pieces. In the middle of each of these images is like a hash mark. I often play with dots and hash marks in the pieces. So you can see there's a line in one and a plus in the next one. I think they serve as ways to demarcate the foreground and to sort of bring in the idea of measurement. And in this case, in a lot of optical devices, when you're using scientific devices to measure something, the actual binoculars or microscope will have ticks along the side so you can focus something or bring something in and out of focus. So in the work, I try to also bring in, whenever I can, ways to sort of denote or think about the voice of the microscope. Like, what does the microscope see and how does its relationship to what we understand get involved? We think of ourselves and the object, but how do we bring the microscope back into that perception of the seeing process? Our last piece, our last scientific image to bring in was Yanu's piece. And this is the DNA piece. And this one was a little difficult because I was like, okay, I built this very specific system. I have earth, water, and air, so now I need fire. And it was interesting to try to figure out what scientific image would represent fire. DNA is inherently, how it changes and shifts is chemical, and there's chemical reactions when it, reproduces itself and shifts, as well as being sort of like the fire of life, the sort of building blocks for life in general. So I was like, DNA it is for my fire object. This is Yanu. She has family members that are involved in the sciences, and she was really interested in biology, but she did not want to watch things, she said. She was like, I just want to get involved in how things operate. I don't want to just observe things. I also want to make things. So she got into this biomedical space. And so again, she's working with DNA, but she's crafting DNA. She's making DNA do certain things and weave certain ideas. She's also really, really interested in photography and does photo negatives where she transposes images on different things. So it was cool to meet someone who has their own artistic process, which in the future, again, as we get more and more work done, it'll be really interesting to me to bring in people's personal practice as part of the work. Another artist that I spend a lot of time looking at is Emma Koontz. She actually didn't totally identify as an artist. She identified as a healer. She's a Swiss healer, and she did a lot of different body work and sort of meditation work with people. And she built these sort of spiral graph geometric images. Again, these really speak to me in terms of the science images that I'm making, because I think they visually look a lot like optical patterns. So often when we're trying to learn and understand how we see, it's about the light waves and how they bounce back and how the cones in our eyes receive those light waves. I think when you look at these geometric drawings, there are patterns and ways of seeing that let you sort of get a sense of like, oh, what might that reflection process kind of be like in my own brain? And I think her work really speaks to that kind of visual. Here's another base layer that I use. This one, I looked into doing some fire photography to try to get some base layers, but fire photography is very complicated. You have to be able to have a really fast setup because fire moves so much. So the closest I came currently is taking pictures of the sky again, because the sunlight on the clouds has a real fire effect. But I hope to someday maybe get into more fire photography. It's like slowly revealing. This is like late 90s image processing when you had to wait for things to load on your screen. So you can see here are my vertical fire lines and my sort of fiery background, and I am building these diamond shapes of my diamond DNA. And you're sort of moving them, trying to create a mid space. I take a look a lot at Bridgette Riley's work as well. She was a British painter, English painter from the 60s, and she does these wild optical illusions. This one, I'm sorry for you, it is difficult to look at on a screen. It'll make you a little fuzzy trying to look at it because it actually feels like it moves. But again, she sort of makes these paintings that speaks to kind of these optical math spaces. So I sort of feel like she's kind of representing how light is moving and kind of giving you this cartoon for it. So here we are, I'm working on, you can see the fire piece on the far left, and I'm taking a look at all of the pieces together, as well as sort of with these artists that I'm interested in. And again, I think this talk was interesting to put together just because of the nature of these screenshots. Like I've never taken so many screenshots. I didn't have to go back and recreate any of these. These were just on my computer. So it was like me trying to record my thinking process during the whole creative construction. And I have never done it to this detail before. So it was just interesting that the talk sort of already existed. So here we are. I sort of was like, I think the fire piece needs to have more of a flame shape to it. It's too, the diamonds were too hard. So I created this sort of more soft flame shape. You can see they're kind of eye shapes. Here, the circles kind of shift to create that kind of way that you see the different shapes around a like small candle flame. You can sort of see the flicker. Here the shapes are changing size. And there's only slight difference, but there's a slight soft center circle in the final sort of fire piece to kind of bring your eye to the center of it and allow you to read the piece. So again, I'm interested in bringing people's attention to this kind of thing because I think often in abstract imagery, you know, people don't feel invited to read the piece. So when you look at a landscape, you can say, oh, I see a tree in the foreground and I see a sheep and I see the sunset. I understand what this is about. This is a land that I can see. And I think there are a lot of ways to read and see abstract art as well that are more about form and texture and movement. But I do think you have to kind of be invited. You can be invited into those spaces. And I sort of often seek to try to make the abstraction a little easier on the eyes with patterns. Like, how do I invite you into this abstract image by sort of showing you where to look first? Where is my foreground and where is my background? And even those like soft shape invitations hopefully give you a way to know where can your eye rest? I brought back in diamonds and here we are. Now you can see them all lined up again, and I have our earth and our air and our fire. And as I was looking at all of them, I went back to my water piece and I was like, this water piece doesn't fit with the rest of them. It's sort of an outlier. Why are there words on it? It's not working. So I went back into it and looked back at my colors and I was like, I think the water piece is too white. It needs to bring more blue back into its shapes. So I totally changed its palette, and I only knew how to do this right after I had made the other 4 pieces. So it wasn't like I thought it was done weeks ago. And then I looked at it in relationship to all the other ones and I was like, nope, it's not done. I have to go back and fix it. So as I brought it in, also my central circles that my fish and my data points sat on were not the right color anymore because they needed to like say something new, point out the fish more clearly. I brought in yellows. You can see I still have the text on there. Why is the text on there? You can't even read it. I created this. This is a whole series of trying to make them glow. You can see my glowing surfaces under my circles. So here's even more glowing, softly glowing, trying to see if you can see the fish better if I make it glow with small digital painting. And finally, I got my chartreuse to kind of like fix the image. Mm-hmm. And by this point, we were getting close to the show. In the next image, you'll see I'm mocking up all of these pieces to be printed on 6-foot-tall banners that will be in the park. So on the front side of each banner will be the art image, and on the back side will be the scientific description, as well as the original image, so people can read them. And I mocked them up. I was like, okay, this is looking great. We can keep moving. Here's my air pieces. And even at this final stage of the work, when I'm getting ready to send to the printer, I was like, oh no, this piece doesn't work. And I threw it back into this drawing board to see, like, once I saw all of the layers of the original piece, I thought, I don't know if I featured those images big enough in the actual piece. Like, I think I need to re-centralize the original scientific image so that my idea isn't overtaking its visual presence in the piece. So I restructured it. I played around with a bunch. Oh, here's circles and lines, circles, lines, circles, more lines, trios, quartets. Ooh, there we go. And then I found this sort of way, I kicked my original obsession of the lunar cycle out of the piece because it was overtaking it, and instead made the layers the centralized image, but try to bring in this sort of orbital experience to kind of build in time that way. So here were my original 4 images, but 4 groups of images. And here are my final 5 pieces for the show. And here they are in the park, so people could stop by and see them. It was a wonderful experience to try to make art that people could see even during a pandemic. I prefer art on walls because I like walking up to art inside of spaces, but this was a really cool way to expand my brain and put art out into other places. And I actually think a lot more people saw the work who might not go seeking the work. So it was a really cool opportunity to shift that perspective. And it's definitely a place that I want to keep investigating. Here are the breath pieces in the park with all the beautiful trees last May. Here's the final earth piece, again, amidst all of the lovely green that is finally coming back to us. And thank you so much. That was my wild, way too many screenshot collection of the last Art of Science creation process. Again, this interdependencies show is on Friday. I hope you were able to see some of the slides as I was going. Again, I love this job and this position. I'm so thankful that the Institute is interested in supporting this line of research. And I'm hoping that in my process of being here and doing this kind of work that I can actually hopefully encourage and enthuse other institutions of science to hire their own artists on staff, because I think there's something pretty special about being able to spend a huge portion of my time really investing in the idea process and investing in a collaboration with the scientific topics, so that we can build something complex out of them. And I think our institution is supposed to be about collaboration between lots of different sciences. So chemists and geologists and anthropologists all come together to work on big genomics projects. And I'm really honored and thankful that I get to sort of do the same thing in my corner with art projects. So yeah, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks for looking at my weird brain with my hundreds of screenshots from the last year. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to field any questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for talking with us, Julia. It was great. I apologize sorry for the issues, the technical issues. No. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask, or if you're shy, you can type them in the chat.
Julia, how long did it take you to put the series together? Or if it's easier, when did you start working on the series that will debut later this week?
It's kind of complicated because often I'll take a little bit of a break in the summer months and not make as much art, and then sort of start doing interviews in the fall. So September, October, November, kind of start doing interviews and gathering images. And then by December, January, February, it's like, oh, we got to make stuff, we got to put stuff together, get stuff back to people in enough time if they don't like it to shift it. So it can be a long process, and I'm still experimenting with the right timeline for that. Plus this year, I shouldn't say it on Zoom, but it was a difficult January and February, I must say, as a person with a small child. It was a lot this year, but I'm really glad that it came together. And yeah, good question. Thank you.
Julia, a lot of these have a dreamlike quality to them. And I'm wondering if, as you're creating these pieces, you ever dream about the challenge of the work that you're doing, and do the dreams filter into the pieces?
That's cool. I dig it. Good question. Sadly, if I'm dreaming about artist science, it's usually like a panic dream that it's the day before the show and none of the work is printed, or like none of the work is done. And then I'm like frantically running around in the dream being like, well, I gotta make art. I mean, I think speaking to what you're saying is, I think like if you think about the other artists that I kind of showed you during the talk, I think they're really trying to think about meditation and thought. And I think if I'm relating that to the idea of like a dream, like what is something that, how do you express something that is not necessarily a fixed idea that has certain outcomes or specific facts, but something that is a generalized sense of something. And I think when you can kind of capture a space of a sense of something, I think you get sort of closer to how people have memories, because often they're not specific. There are these sort of feels. And that's a great compliment. Thank you so much, because I feel like often the scientific images feel very exact, so they can be scary to interact with because you don't want to like ruin the data points. Yeah. So it's like, how do you create a sensibility for it by still keeping it intact? So it's an interesting problem. It's like, yeah, like how do you write a poem about it without ruining it? Essentially the problem. Good question.
Hey, Julia, I had a question actually about, you know, at the beginning, you had that list of your process and there was like the 5 or 6 steps. Towards the end, there was like the approval where you brought in, you know, you went back to the artist or I'm sorry, to the scientist or engineer and asked them, what do they think? Can you tell us, like, I don't know, how did that go? Because you showed us kind of your process today in your brain. But what happened when you brought them in? What happened at that point?
Yeah, it's always kind of scary. It definitely takes trust, which is why I think the biggest part of talking to the scientists is important for me in the beginning process, because I think even just by having a conversation, especially over Zoom, I think is super valuable, because they can sort of just see my body in space, and we can kind of have an interaction that I hope creates some kind of trust. Because if I tell them about how excited I am and how cool their images is and how valuable I'm interested in pursuing their work, I think that creates trust. And then when I bring it back to them, I try to create sort of a couple of sentences that speak to what I did and why. And then I always, in that email and space, am like, this is a process. If you have concerns, if this doesn't feel right to you, like, let's talk about it. Let's go back over it. And it's really interesting because some people, it's just dependent on people. Some people are like, cool, I love it, it's awesome. And they're just like, down for whatever, you know, and they don't even feel like they're like, I don't think I need to critique this. It's just cool. And some people are really want to engage with the idea of it and have a lot of critiques. They're like, well, what does this part mean? And I can't really see this part of my science here. And would you mind making this part of this sort of more forward in the piece? Would you mind making it more centralized? There was a really cool moment I had my first year when I was doing this. I had never done this before, so I was very nervous about it. But I made a piece for a young woman over, I think she was material science. And I brought her this piece, and it was, you know, I had taken some real wild, you know, visual liberties with her piece. And I brought it over to her and I was like, okay, this is what I've done with it. This is what I'm thinking. This is my artistic process. And she sort of said, okay. And then she was like, I'm going to show it to my lab. And she didn't really like respond like wholeheartedly. So I was super worried. I was like, oh no, she hates it. She doesn't know how to tell me to my face. I wrote her an email. I was getting ready to type her this long email that was like, if we want to make this like more traditional, if we need to move the whole piece's direction around, I'm totally okay with that. And then before I had even gotten back to my desk, she had already written me an email and she said, I showed my lab group and they loved it. And I realized this person she didn't feel like she was allowed to say whether she didn't even know that she was allowed to be like, I like it or I don't like it. She was like, I don't know what this is. So it was super valuable to me to like be in these kind of situations that are a little scary, like, oh no, someone's gonna hate me. And then often the most like moments where I'm most unsure is people who are like, I don't know. They really honestly have never, you know, I mean, I'm not saying that like all scientists are monoliths, but there's a large portion of scientists that don't study art because they study science. So like some people are like, well, I don't know anything about art, so this is, you know, whatever. And she just didn't know how to articulate that. So it was a cool moment of trying to learn how to forget my own expectations and keep an open mind and be willing to shift things. But I've also had a couple pieces where the person has gotten really involved with the visual expression and they have a lot of edits. And those pieces have turned out really cool too, because they've pushed the piece in a direction I wouldn't necessarily have gone. And I think in a different space where you're just an artist and it's just your work, I can imagine that level of critique, I think can only be given by people who are like, you know, you really trust. Whereas this problem is a totally different kind of weird problem. It's about like, how do we talk about literally as many kinds of science as possible in one art show, which is like a ridiculous thing to try to do. So I think it's also like like that part of it makes me feel kind of humble, because it's like, well, if this isn't working, we'll try something else. Like this isn't like my one true expression of my own self-identity. This is me trying to build a story around your image. So it also gives me some freedom to not feel so precious about the work. And it's teaching me to kind of be like, well, yeah, let's change it. That was a long-winded answer, but the process of talking to people, I think it's really fun. It's scary, but it's fun.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you're right, that crossover is kind of weird. So I'm glad you've been able to navigate it. It makes sense that it varies so much. So thanks.
Yeah. Different people.
I threw in some links in the chat. One's to our general website page that has like all of the years of the art of science. And the other, some links that Julia gave me ahead of time that are videos of last year's images, the images we saw today set to music. And so they're YouTube videos with those.
Oh yeah, they're super dreamy and cool. So since this was a remote show, I tried to make a digital component to all the work. In the future, I'd like to build maybe a different digital space so you can navigate to them easier. But each of these 5 pieces that I showed you have an interview with me and the scientist that you can listen to. And so you can listen to me talk to the scientist about their image and you can hear the scientist's voice. And then each of the pieces has like a very dreamy, chill 1-minute meditation video of the piece and some elements of the piece sort of softly moving and softly shifting. And shout out, I think you might be here. My brother set the music to the pieces. They're very cool. You should give them a listen. Give them a quick meditate. I'm glad we didn't play. I originally had a couple of the movies in this presentation, but they were not loading correctly. And after all the loading, I'm very glad we didn't try to play them. I think it can only be given by people who are like, you really trust. Whereas this problem is a totally different kind of weird problem. It's about like, how do we talk about. Is that me talking, Danny? I think it is. It's like a weird
Maybe.
YouTube feedback. Man, YouTube Live is weird. Does anyone else have any questions? Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, if there's no other questions, yeah. Thank you again, Julia. It was great. I was super excited to hear about your process, and this is one of the most. Some freedom to not.
Hey, Julia.
Yes. Hi. Oh, did we lose you?
I might have just muted them because I thought that was the voice.
Oh, I think it's the live stream.
Oh.
Maybe.
Hey, Julia, this is Peter. I was just wondering if you had thought about expanding this sort of art interaction with other entities like manufacturing. If art is a reflection of society, then we should have an artist in every sort of venue that reflect the feelings of society in an appropriate and
Totally, Peter. I totally agree with you. You kind of went out, but I feel like I know exactly the vibe of your question. Yes, we do work with other institutions to put up old shows, but we did actually work with Abbott Laboratories to put together an Art of Science show, and we used one of their specimens to create a special singular piece for their Art of Science at Abbott collection. And I think what you're talking about is a really cool process that I'm really interested in researching, because there's been other examples of this through time. The Bell company and a bunch of technology companies in the 60s had artists in residences, as well as in the early, in the 30s and 40s, the public works projects that funded artists in this country employed artists to do a lot of different things at education institutions and scientific institutions. So I think this is I agree with you, important political thing to have artists employed in every location. I'm trying to figure out how to be better in my action to encourage other people to have positions like mine. Oh, this is so psychedelic to hear myself giggle back on the YouTube Live.
Oh, is that what that is?
I think it is.
Okay.
I think so. I think maybe Peter is listening to the YouTube stream or someone else is. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent questions. It was so good to see everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks again.
Bye.